place. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Here it comes. Okay, so you can all see my screen, right?
Yeah.
Start the slideshow. There we go. So we'll talk about container gardening. When I'm not out in the garden, I am either teaching at the New York Botanical Garden or writing books. So this is what I do in my off hours. So go to the library and ask for my books. This is me out in the garden early in the spring. So you can see the tulips are still in bloom, and the shrubs haven't even come out much. You can see turf grass is not the thing to ask me about. So if you love your lawn, my husband calls it my so-called lawn. It's not that great, but at least I don't have to put pesticides on it. This is my husband. We also have 2 community garden plots, one in Morristown that's run by Frelinghuysen Arboretum, and the other in Chatham. This is the one in Chatham. You'll see that one of our local Eagle Scouts was nice enough to put in these raised bed boxes for us, so that's really nice. And actually, this particular bed I share with another woman. She has half of it and I have the other half. That's me with some of my tomatoes. I love my tomatoes. I don't have a ripe tomato yet, but I'm really looking forward to them, and they're really bearing fruit now, so that's exciting. For a while, I thought this spring that I was not going to have access to either of my community gardens, which kind of put me in a panic, because I thought that I was going to have to buy store-bought tomatoes, if all the farmers markets were closed. So that's why I really got interested in container gardening, around my house this spring. I love flowers, so mostly around my house, where I have some sun, which isn't much, I do have flowers. So that's why I've kind of opted to do the vegetables more in the community garden. And gardening is not often easy. So this is after Sandy. You can see that's our neighbor's tree that is smashed through the trellis. Luckily, it did not hit the house, but that was really quite amazing. Okay, if you're starting with any kind of gardening, but certainly with container gardening, the main thing is to figure out what are the conditions. So how cold is it? For those of you in Waunakee, you might be a little colder. Yes, no, or is it a little colder than Chatham? I know my sister's up in Sussex County. She's always quite a bit colder. She gets frost earlier, she gets snow later. So in Chatham and Morris County, we're on the eastern side of Morris County, we tend to be kind of 6B. That really just is saying, how cold does it get and when is the first and last frost dates? And you can find these plant hardiness maps online. You can get them by New Jersey, and you can see obviously where the elevation is higher, the zone is smaller. So it goes, up towards zone 5 when you get up to the top near High Point. And you can look it up, you just type your zip code into this really handy tool online. Again, if you just type in Google or your search engine, whatever, Chrome, you type in plant hardiness zones, you'll get something like this, and you can put in your zip code. Okay, so here's my back. It's pretty shady. You can see on either side of the patio, I've got some containers, and on the left side of this picture, you'll also see a nice tall container, which I use to give the garden in that area a little bit of extra height. That works well too. If you grow plants in containers, certainly, or in the garden, you can stretch out the hardiness of your, sort of period by sometimes running out and throwing towels, or in this case, I got out a box of Hefty bags and I put them over the things. In this case, it was dahlias that were a little cold tender. So that you don't have to worry about in July. You start having to worry about it around the 1st of October. So containers. things like lettuce and spinach in this container. This container is probably 1.5 feet tall and probably about the same wide. I put lettuce and spinach to start with. These I bought at a nursery. So again, during the pandemic, you know, we first had lockdown. Well, the nurseries at least were open. So I could get a couple of things like spinach and lettuce. And these, I kept picking them. So you don't have to wait until the heads or the spinach is all mature. You can start picking the outer leaves. And these, I had a couple pots of greens. They really furnished our salad for quite a while. Now it's a little too hot, so the lettuce all goes to both. So deciding what you want to grow, my main advice is grow what you like to eat, because what tends to happen is you get a lot of whatever it is you plant. As long as it's reasonably successful, you suddenly have loads of lettuce. It's also really helpful to find some friends so that you can share your lettuce crop. Now the lettuce is over and I'm starting to get the zucchini, you know, it's just like an avalanche, right? Every day I go out and there's more zucchini. So my answer to that is, you know, I pick them when they're about this big and I use them on salads because, you know, you turn your back for a couple of days and all of a sudden they go from this big, then there's this big, and then they're the size of baseball bats. You can see I've got my seeds reasonably well organized. It took a long time for me to get to this place. These are actually old, you know, do you remember diskettes that you used to put in your computer, those square plastic things that you'd stick in the slots? That's what these are. They're old boxes for diskettes. They work really well. Also old like lettuce boxes if you buy lettuce or spinach in the food store. And I store my seeds in the fridge. If you have room, that's the way to extend their life the longest. If you have them, as long as they're in a cool, dry place, it's fine. But I found that the germination rate stays higher from year to year if I keep things in the fridge. I try to buy seeds that are open pollinated. Those pretty ones down at the bottom are the Hudson Valley Seed Company. And so they have all heirloom varieties, which means if you let their lettuce go to seed, it will self-sow in your garden, or you can collect the seed. So that's really fun when the lettuce just comes up the following year. So again, with selection, just try to think about what do I like to eat and what do I kind of have space for, although I don't always practice what I preach there. This is a summer box, so these are things, let's see. This is probably from about the end of July, maybe the beginning of August. So you can see what I was harvesting, and most of these things I'll be harvesting again this year. So from left to right, obviously the tomato, there's an onion, some beets. Fennel, I find is very good. It's pretty, the butterflies like swallowtails will sometimes leave caterpillars on the fennel, which means they're going to eat some of the leaves, but I love butterflies, so that's okay. The little carrots and the little beets are great to grow in containers because they're fairly small. Kohlrabi, an interesting kind of weird vegetable that I think is fun because it bulbs up over the ground. And garlic, super easy to grow and a lot of fun. You can grow all sorts of things, kind of do it yourself. So this was a project I was working on with sweet potatoes because that's actually mentioned in one of the Little House on the Prairie books. And so, you know, Ma Ingalls is growing sweet potatoes from one that she keeps. And so I tried that. It does work. You root them in a jar just like you did when you were in kindergarten, and you pop off the little shoots and root them and put them in the ground or in a container. So this is not my container, but this is a container down at the U.S. Botanic Garden in Washington, D.C. It's my picture. The color's not so good. I don't know what happened to the camera. I probably had it set wrong. But look at the size of the sweet potato vine. Now this is the same sweet potato that you eat. You know, it's a tuber and, you know, they really grow like gangbusters. So you need a really huge container. This one is probably 3 to 3.5 feet tall, and again, about as wide. And you can see how big the sweet potato vine is getting. But those are edible tubers, even the variegated ones. I do have grow lights, so this is my basil crop coming up this past spring. I will say though, my aunt, who is in her 90s now and is a terrific gardener, starts all of her seeds on her windowsill. So, you know, yeah, grow lights are nice, but they're not absolutely necessary. And I love basil. I make a lot of pesto and I eat a lot of pesto. And this is what it's starting to look like now. I keep it cut and it just keeps coming. Also edible flowers. So again, if you're trying to make containers that look pretty in addition to being edible, great to put in some edible flowers like these little Johnny jump ups. They can be added to a salad. They're very nice and sort of, I don't know, tangy and pretty. The calendula is starting to bloom in my garden now. This is another edible flower. Again, very pretty, and you just take the petals and sort of sprinkle them in your salad. Also, I have a friend who makes a salve out of calendula flowers. So I guess it's good for that too. Nasturtiums, another edible flower. Again, a very kind of peppery taste. And I will say, if you see these in a gourmet market or at a farmer's market, they're tremendously expensive to buy the little flowers. I saw them once in New York at Dean and DeLuca, or one of those very fancy shops, and there was a plastic container of them. They were very pretty, but it wasn't very big. And it was like, I don't know, $15 or something. I was so proud of myself. So you're gonna have to find a container and fill it. Almost anything works. So this is this past winter in New York City. I was walking down the street. It was around 20th Street. And on top of someone's air conditioner was a row of pots. And that was their herb garden. So, you know, if you're in a place where you've got a lot of space, that's great. But if you don't have a lot of space, if you're in a townhouse or an apartment and you just have a little bit of space, you can still grow some edible plants. And I think make it very pretty. So obviously there's rosemary. I think the other terracotta pot is mint, maybe thyme, and oregano is what I would guess the other ones are. But really quite a bit that they could use for their kitchen right outside their apartment door. So I thought that was great. This is a friend of mine who has never grown vegetables. She has quite a few flowers, but again, she was inspired by the pandemic to try some new containers. These are so-called self-watering containers. So she bought them on Amazon. They have a little tube, and I think they have this red thing, the indicator on the, you know, the sort of the bottom of the photo. And so they stay well watered. She grew a lot of greens and radishes. Those were all from seeds that I gave her. And then she got some transplants for things like nasturtiums and a few strawberries. But she calls this her fun acres, and she really has enjoyed it. This was an image that I got off one of the Master Gardener websites, just to say, it doesn't have to be fancy, right? You don't have to go onto a garden website or Amazon and spend a lot of money on a container, as long as you're there to water it. So someone has just kind of knocked together some boards here, and it looks like the bottom is probably some sort of screening. And they grew a cherry tomato quite successfully. Now, the only thing would be this would dry out very quickly. Now, a trick you can do, I'm just going to stop the share for a minute and show you. So a trick you can do is to get one of these products. There's one called Soil Moist. This one's called TerraSorb. And there are these little oh, they're little plastic things, plastic polymers. It's sort of like the stuff that they put in disposable diapers, right? Why just diapers are absorbent. You can mix that in with your potting soil. The key is to wet it first, separately. So I've done it. I think a lot of gardeners have done this. The first time you use it, you think, well, I'll mix it in the potting soil and then I'll water it. And then what happens is the stuff expands and it starts to bubble out. And you get all these polymers coming out. So just remember, wet the polymers. I'm sure that's on the directions, and the problem is who reads the directions, and then mix it into your potting soil. Another thing you can do for feeding is you can put in one of these time release fertilizers like Osmocote. Again, that's not for that particular brand, but it's a time release, so you don't have to keep remembering to fertilize your containers. Because the amount of soil you have around the plant roots is relatively small, that's why feeding and watering becomes more important when you are container growing a plant. So I'll just go back to screen share and back in our little slideshow. So, you can get a lot of nice cherry tomatoes off of one container. This is a friend of mine in Morristown. Her containers are so beautiful. So you can see she has her little herb garden here. One thing I want to point out is the pot on the top step, mint, right? Mint is great to grow in containers and not so great to grow in the ground because it's really aggressive and it takes over. So even the mint that I have in my herb garden, I sink a pot into the ground so that it keeps the roots contained. And every year I lift the pot out and check the bottom because they will also try to escape out the bottom. They're really very happy and want to share or don't want to share. This was a fun project I did for one of the New Jersey Convention Center programs. They wanted to do unusual containers. So if you get olive oil containers, some of them are very lovely. You can just poke holes in the bottom with a big nail, and you can use them for containers. Really anything. You just have to kind of suit the size of the plant to the container you have. So again, that's a lot of fun to just sort of think about other possible creative reuse that you can do. Again, this is another one of mine. You can see I stuck some pansies in with some different colored lettuces. That's very pretty to do. And since then, I've actually changed those out, and now they have herbs in them, and in one case, they have a tomato plant. This is at my community garden, so you do not have to be fancy at all. Here's someone has taken their old sort of weeding buckets, and they do tend to crack, and they have just, put holes in the bottom and now are growing eggplants in them. And I will tell you, they're doing beautifully. So that was like, bravo, that's really great. And here is actually the same plot. You can see this person has really tried to, stretch the rules. They have even taken their soil bags and again, poked holes in them so they have drainage, filled them up, and I think there are cucumber plants growing in them. So I can't wait to see how they do in those kind of non-containers, because if you buy grow bags, they're quite expensive. And there's a close-up of one. Maybe that's a squash, I can't tell. So, and they've put a cage around it so that it can grow up. These are some little containers, sort of, I don't know what, they're sort of half containers and half raised beds. So these little boxes were actually containers from Beds and Borders annuals. It was a collection of them, and they came like that. In the back, the one that's covered up, because it was still cold, is a wine box. So if you go to your liquor store or your local wine dealer, see if they have wooden wine cases, because they make actually pretty good containers. These little ones, I knocked the bottoms out with a hammer, so they're actually just sitting on the ground. The wine box is full of turnip greens and kale, and it's just full of soil. So I left the bottom intact there. And there they are now, just to give you an idea. Again, this is just a little corner of my garden that was always just Pachysandra. The Pachysandra had kind of been dying out anyway. So I thought, okay, well, I may not have any other garden. Let's see what I can shoehorn in here. And I've gone totally overboard. So this giant thing on the left is a pumpkin vine, which my husband says it looks like, oops, it looks like it wants to come in the house with us. There are beans going over that hoop. Those are pole beans. There are tomatoes that are kind of straggly because they don't really get enough sun there. And there's lettuce that's just kind of petering out now. And some Swiss chard, which the groundhog now seems to be eating. So this one is kind of a funny thing. So my sister gave me these two tiny little Pony Express tomatoes that she had bought somewhere. And I had 3 pots. So the one on the left is about a foot tall, then maybe a foot and a half, then 2 feet. That's a big pot on the right. So I chose a pot the size of that 2-foot pot. I actually ended up finding a pretty ceramic pot instead of using the black plastic one. And that's where it is. So that is that tiny little tomato start that I put in this big, it was a big pot without a hole in it. I guess it was supposed to be for an indoor plant. My husband drilled some holes in the bottom for me. And you can see that little tiny tomato plant has turned into a giant, it's a plum tomato called Pony Express. And I think it's going to have a really good heavy crop. So that's fun. You can see the ones in the background are those pots that had the lettuce in them. So the one to the left now has a little cherry tomato called Bumblebee, and the one on the right now has lemon verbena in it. This is, again, at my community garden, but more of this idea of just using a box. So if you have a limited amount of space, but you don't want to do a container and you do have a sunny spot, you can just make a couple little square boxes out of plywood. You know, if you get some length sawed to the same size, these are just held together with nails, and they last quite a few years. This is probably their 4th or 5th year. And in these, I have lettuce and stir-fried greens and garlic, and then I added my fennel in there as well. So you can get quite good production out of that. And there's a close-up just to give you an idea of the spacing. The woman who gardens next to me said, "Your garden looks like Martha Stewart's." I said, "Well, I don't have anything else to do, so just come down here and fuss with it." This was a house in Denver where they just dug up their front yard and put their vegetables out there. So I thought, well, that's good. That's all the sun you have. This is in Portsmouth, New Hampshire a few years ago, but I noticed that they had Swiss chard as a, kind of an ornamental crop along with this fancy grass and those little sunflowers, which is quite pretty. Watering, you got to keep watering, especially when it's dry. Feed once in a while, or use this time release feeder, or plant things that don't require any water. So in my ornamental containers, I use a lot of succulent plants because you never really have to water them. They will wait until it rains, and they just don't seem to care. So that's my advice there. Critters. So critters happen. You can see I have a variety of little cage type things. So this is over again, one of my little raised beds. It's just a square of what's called hardware cloth. But there's poultry netting, which is also a kind of metal thing. You can just make a sort of box or a little hoop. That really helps. Bugs. So you get all sorts of bugs. This is, again, I think a swallowtail caterpillar, which is on the parsley. They start out tiny. When they really start eating, they eat a lot. So I try to plant extra of the things that the butterflies like, so that if they're eating some of it, I still have enough parsley to make my sauce. There it is on the rue, which I don't actually eat. I think it's a pretty plant, but you know, I think this is great to see the caterpillars out there munching. You can try anything. So this was, if you've ever bought lettuce that comes in a dome and has roots on it, you know, at the food store, sometimes they'll sell those. They're grown hydroponically. I have eaten the head of lettuce and planted the result, either inside under grow lights or outside in the garden. In both cases, I've gotten nice second growth heads of lettuce. So, you know, if you think it might work, try it. Why not, right? Doesn't cost anything. I do save some of my tomato seeds, which is kind of a gooey project, but it's kind of fun to have them from year to year, especially if someone has given you a particular variety or there's one that you like. Okay, so what about a few ornamentals? Again, basically you can grow anything in the pot. So here there are two pots. On the left, there's a hydrangea in a pot. On the right, there's a strawberry jar filled with little hostas, which are very cute. This is not my garden. You know, I don't even remember whose garden this was, but I just thought it was adorable with all of these little hostas. Also, I will say strawberry jars seem to be one of those things that people put out in their trash. I guess they try it and they don't like it. So I have gotten a couple of strawberry jars that way. There it is close up. Isn't that cute? I put mint in one this year and then put little strawberries on the side. These are my pots. I can't remember what year this was, but you can see on my patio, which actually does get very, very hot. I don't try many flowers. The only thing you see blooming there is that little portulaca, which is like a succulent. But I like this, the plants like agaves and sedums because I think they're interesting. And you can also see I have a weird collection of old bricks. That was, I think, a different year. So, you know, I rearrange them. I try different things. Some of them come in for the winter. Some of them don't. This year I had an orchid cactus that somebody gave me. So that went in the pot. And you can just change them up. So I have a lot of fun with that. And I even used them in my window box because I found that I couldn't keep the window box wet enough. So I put all of these various kinds of succulents in, and then they grow nicely for the whole summer. And then my big tall pot, I put in this sea of Pachysandra just to give it a little more interest. And I try different things with that. This year I had yellow willow sticks in it with a lot of yellow flowers and plants. There it is grown in a little bit. A friend of mine made me that dragonfly. This year I had these funny blue succulents. It's a kind of Senecio, and then that strange taller one is actually a pencil plant. Pansies in the spring. This year I've got begonias in it. This is a friend of mine who really does up her patio with a lot of containers, and her patio is in the shade. But she has a lot of color because she uses all of the different coleus, some begonias, and usually a few hostas as well. And the hostas, she does not take out of their pots in the winter. She just puts them underneath her deck, and they do fine. They come back the following year just as strong or stronger. So that's one thing that you can try with pots, is not to empty them all out and see how they do. If you can give them some cover, that usually helps. So with my little pots that I keep out on the patio, I just shove them under the table. She uses her deck as a kind of cover. It keeps the snow off of them, and it seems to keep the pots from cracking. Okay, what's the best? The best, of course, is the harvest. These were strawberries coming on in a little pot, which was very fun. I love it when the beets come in. You may not like beets, but I do. I pick a lot of lettuce, both from containers and from the garden. I'm still picking it, but it's about done, and I need to get some seeds started for my fall crop. I like cooking, so this was zucchini meatballs. Great to make salads. Again, you can see the edible flowers mixed in. Soon I have to find lots of recipes for those zucchini, but this was spinach. And gardening with friends is a lot of fun. So that's my friend Doris. We often garden together. And that's one of my granddaughters who doesn't like to garden as much as water. She loves to water. You get things like hummingbirds, which are a real joy, and of course the butterflies, which are starting. That was another message from our sponsor. I think that's it. So I'm going to get out of screen share and see what questions you all have. Any questions? Oh, we need to unmute you all.
Yeah, I'm working on that.
Okay. Or what do you all grow in your containers?
I don't have containers, so now it's I'm excited to try.
Sure.
What kind of soil do you recommend to use in the containers?
So in closed containers, I use some kind of sterile potting mix. Whatever brand you want to use, I often use Espoma products, but you know, some people use Miracle-Gro or they have another brand that they like. It really doesn't matter. The reason you start with a sterile mix is in a closed container, you do have sometimes more of a problem with different kinds of pests and diseases. And so if you start with a sterile mix, you're a little less likely to have that as opposed to just using garden soil. The other reason is they generally have something that will help them drain. It's usually perlite or vermiculite. And it's, you know, it's sort of a tried and true method. So what I usually do at the beginning of the season, because I have a lot of pots and some of them are quite big, is I go to Agway, which we have one not far from us, and I get a bale of Promix. It's heavy, but it lasts the whole season.
And what kind of plants would you recommend starting this late in the season in the containers?
Again, it depends on what you like. Swiss chard is very reliable and it kind of grows and grows. In about a month, maybe 3 weeks, you can put out fall lettuce and spinach. The problem is it's hard to get them to germinate if you're trying them from seed because they can't germinate in 90-degree weather. So you either have to start them inside or find, if your nursery, you know, you can ask the nursery, say, are you going to get fall transplants? And then that's really great because then you get a whole nother season out of them. It's going to be hard now to find things like tomato plants to put in a container. You can still maybe get annuals, but even the annuals, if you go to the nursery now, the annuals they're selling you, they're usually in a big pot, right? They want to sell you the whole pot. So I don't know about that. Herbs you can still put in, you know, whether they're annuals or perennials, you could then put them in the ground. Probably a little late to start zinnias from seed, but you probably still get some bloom by the end of the season. If you're going to grow zinnias in a pot, though, get the miniature varieties. So there's one, I think they're called Tumbelina or something like that. That's small.
I want to interrupt. I grow evergreens in my deck pots, miniature ones.
Terrific.
And it's not a bad time of year in fall to pick them up at different stores and plant them then. They last all winter and they keep something green in your deck pots. And then in summer, I add annuals to it and some other things for color. And the little miniature evergreen is like an anchor in the pot.
Yeah, that's a terrific idea. I know last year at the end of the season when one of the nurseries was clearing out stock, I got a very small variegated boxwood, which I put in a pot and left out on my porch kind of for the holidays because it was sort of festive. And then I planted pansies around it in the spring. So, you know, that sort of thing. And just a couple of weeks ago, I actually put it in the ground. So it's now, you know, actually living in the garden.
Oh, and another one is wintergreen. They always sell that late fall or around Christmas, too early. And it's flowering for me on the deck right now. So it's a beautiful little evergreen to grow.
That's fascinating. I've only ever killed that. It's, you know,
I kill it when I put it in the garden, but believe it or not, it absolutely loves a container. It's doubled in size, and I've never seen them flower like this.
Okay, well, I will try it in a container. It's a little humid here. Like wintergreen grows up at my sister's. She lives in Byram Township, up near Andover, and it's wild. You know, it's native on her property, but it doesn't grow around here. But again, we're lower in elevation, and it's much more humid in Chatham than it is up in Sussex County.
I grow from the kitchen, from the spice cabinet. I take fenugreek seeds and just take a handful of fenugreek and plant. You know, I planted and they come up and they are very lovely to have, like microgreens. They're the first little, and they are very healthy for you to have.
Oh, what a good idea!
In the Indian stores, I mean, we use it in the cooking. It's a bit bitter. But the plant itself is so very tiny, and looks so fresh, and you know, you get a whole pot full of it. You cut it, and then like a friend of ours in Atlanta, she has a big garden, and you know, lots of vegetables she grows. Every week she puts about like a cup of fenugreek, and so she has an eternal supply of these. You can put it in salads, you can put it in, you know, in anything. You can cook it in whichever way you want.
I'll definitely try that. Yes, thank you for.
And it gives you, you know, pleasure to see something come up so soon.
Absolutely. I like chervil, which is it's a kind of ferny short herb, and it's very tasty. Like it sounds like the similar sort of thing on salads. It doesn't last long because it will bolt, but you can continually plant it. And what you're suggesting, where you plant a little every week, it reminds me, because Thomas Jefferson once wrote, you should plant a thimbleful of lettuce seed every week. In other words, that's how you keep always having lettuce coming on.
Nice.
And it sounds like the same sort of thing. Anybody else have suggestions? This is great. I'm getting all sorts of ideas.
Well, I'd like to chime in. I usually sow herbs in pots on my back steps and around the back steps, but it's very shady, so they never do very well. And then if they do well, I think they look so nice that I don't want to pick them. So I loved that idea. You had one shot of somebody's porch or balcony, and I think that's, you know, with a lot of coleus and other things. And I think, if I remember, I would like to try that next year. And in fact, I took a screenshot, if that's allowed.
Oh, good.
To remind me and to inspire me for next year.
Yes, it's absolutely allowed. I now put things on my calendar, you know, that says, you know, plant more blank when I know that I want to plant more seed of something, because what tends to happen is I'm very good in the spring, you know, I remember things, and then by the time it gets hot in the summer, I start forgetting, like, oh no, you know, I don't go out in the garden as often. Thank you.
Yes.
Ro, you had another question.
I had a question. You were saying about lettuce seed, like how I have lettuce growing now, just like in the regular garden, but it turns to seed? I'm not sure.
Yes. So if you get an heirloom variety of lettuce, like there's one called Trout, that is a spotted lettuce, and you let it go to flower, so it bolts, right? You know, it extends and it gets bitter, and you don't want to eat it. But if you leave it there and let it set seed, if it's an heirloom variety, which means it's not a hybrid cross, it will set viable seed and they will drop on the ground. A lettuce in flower, it looks tiny bit like maybe a dandelion. It's the same family, right? It's a daisy family. So it's this little daisy-like flower. And then, you know, the seeds sort of puff out. And I just often leave them. Now, I'm not the tidiest gardener. I don't mind if things sort of are not in rows and they just are a little tiny bit chaotic. You know, I find that then the following year, sometimes it does take a year. The following year, they will start sprouting from seed. So you go, oh, look at that. You just have to learn to recognize, you know, what's the lettuce and what's the weed, but that's true of any kind of gardening. And again, if you look at Seed Savers Exchange or Johnny's Select Seed, or I think even Burpee now will list, you know, which are the heirloom varieties. That's all it means. It means it will come true from seed if the one plant goes to seed. And you can either collect it and plant it the following year or just let it drop.
Marta, I had grown some lettuce in a container at the start of the season, and it was doing great. It was all different varieties. And then it developed little green bugs on it.
Bugs.
Kind of took it over. You know what they might have been?
I'm not sure. Sometimes if I have a bug, I will literally get on Google and type in small green bug on lettuce. And it's amazing. You can often find out what it is. My go-to product, I have a couple. So I'll try Safer Soap, which is really just a kind of sticky soap that'll sometimes knock out an insect problem. If that doesn't work, then I'll use neem, N-E-E-M. It's botanical. Neem is a tree that grows in places like India. And it's often quite effective at, again, sort of eliminating a pest problem on vegetables. You know, it's always a balance because I'm trying to encourage the beneficial insects. And of course, if you use any kind of insecticide, whether it's natural or not, right, you're going to knock out some of the beneficials as well. So I try not to use them, but I do if I have to, because, you know, otherwise you start having the, you know, they're going to eat it all or I'm going to get some. The same reason I have a heart and I'm trying very hard to relocate this groundhog.
The other question is, would you take something like a squash and grow that, or is that too big of a vines for a container?
You can try. I think that one of the things in that bag in my community garden, and that's not my plot, but I'm going to watch it, is some kind of a squash. Something that big. So that's probably, I can't remember how many quarts one of those big sacks of soil is, but maybe it's, you know, 40 quarts. That much soil, you could probably grow a squash if you kept it watered. But that's the problem. It's going to be quite vigorous. There are some smaller squashes. So if you're growing things in containers, look for the, you know, container varieties. And there's even a small now butternut type squash. It's called a honey nut. So that would be the kind of thing I would try. There are tomato varieties that, you know, they're particularly bred or selected for containers because they stay smaller and they're just a little more compact. It's just that will increase your possibility of success by doing something that's just a little smaller scale.
I've grown some baby, like a golden squash I tried to grow, and I was so excited to see all the yellow flowers, but then it's just flowers and then I don't nothing happens. I've got so many flowers and that's it.
Okay, so sometimes with squashes, I have found that I have to actually pollinate them by hand.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know about the softer squashes, but definitely pumpkins, I have to do like kind of in vitro is what I call it. So with a zucchini type squash or a pumpkin, there are male flowers and female flowers.
Oh, okay.
And sometimes they just don't want to do it, you know, naturally. So you have to open up the male flowers and brush the pollen from the male flower onto the female flower, or the fruit doesn't set. It sounds preposterous. And I know that, if some farmer's growing a field of pumpkins, they're not going around and brushing each one, but for some reason, maybe it's just the number of plants, that it isn't enough to naturally pollinate.
Bees.
Not enough bees, maybe, it's like, but it's one way that I have gotten pumpkins, because otherwise you have giant vines and it's like, well, wait a minute. I want a pumpkin out of this.
That's interesting. Thanks.
I do it right now with a Q-tips. I leave Q-tips out. And when I see finally a female flower, I'm like, yay. And I take it, I self-pollinate.
And are you growing pumpkins?
No, squash. The yellow squash and the green zucchinis.
Okay. With zucchinis, I haven't had a problem. They just want to produce more zucchinis. But I definitely have had that problem with any of the hard squashes. It's funny. So any other questions? What are you all growing in your gardens now?
Lots of stuff.
Lots of stuff.
Yeah.
We've got eggplant in the containers. We've got eggplant in the containers. We've got tomatoes in the containers. Broccoli in the container. We have our zucchini right now in the regular garden, and lettuces, 3 different kinds of lettuce we have in the regular garden. String beans. Everything's growing well. Cucumbers. Watermelon. Cantaloupe.
Very good. I find in the community garden, we have a lot of pest issues because it's sort of like a big billboard for all the pests, because, it's all lots and lots of vegetables and grown there every year. And not so much at home. It's not so bad. But that's just sort of the price you pay to get that nice sunny spot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the pests are too much. All my rose plant leaves are eaten. I do put the neem, but maybe I don't put it early enough. And then I have this lily, this white Lilium Casablanca. And before anything, the leaves are all just eaten up. And then sometimes I say, maybe these guys need to eat those fruit leaves. But it looks awful. And then I'm waiting for the flower, but all these chewed up leaves are around them.
So on the lilies, it's a lily beetle. And the lily beetle was a
red one. Yeah.
It's a little red one. You think, oh, that's cute. It's not cute. So I hand pick them, but you have to do it every single day. You have to pick them, squish them, and then check that there are no egg masses underneath the leaves. But I love lilies, and I'm not giving up on them. And then roses, the biggest plague on the roses for me is Japanese beetles. And again, I just hand pick, and I go around with this one of those giant nut jars from Costco filled with soapy water, and it's not fun, but it's just a part of the job. I guess there's a certain satisfaction.
On those leaves,
In fact, this year I had a problem with Japanese beetles on the hydrangea leaves. For some reason, they started eating those. There's an author named Michael Pollan. Some of you may have read his books. And he wrote a wonderful book called Second Nature. And in it is one of my favorite lines. He says, "Nature abhors a garden." And I think it's true. It's just, it's like it's a constant, I hate to say fight, but it seems like a fight sometimes. It's a constant effort. Okay, well, it seems like that's all the questions.
Well, thank you everybody for coming.
Yeah,
Thanks for setting it up. This was
It's my
great.
pleasure. Thank you for your attention. Stay healthy and happy gardening.
Thank you, Marta.
Thank you.
Bye.
This was a lovely
Thank
session.
you. Bye.
Nice to see you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Do you need me any more, Mary? Or are we good?
No, I just have to tell you we're mailing your check tomorrow. So thank you very
that's
much.
fine.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks everybody. Have a good night.
Mary,
Bye.
thanks for doing this.
No problem, Beth. See you guys later.
Bye.
Bye.